The dusty road between Jerusalem and Emmaus stretches endlessly under the scorching Middle Eastern sun, where Dr. Samuel Cross clutches a leather satchel containing documents that could topple the Vatican. For 20 years, he's been archaeology's golden boy, the man who made biblical discoveries headline news worldwide. But this find is different. These aren't just ancient texts. They're first-hand accounts of conversations Jesus had with his disciples, teachings never recorded in any gospel. The problem? Powerful people want him silenced permanently. 3 attempts on his life in the past week prove someone will kill to keep these revelations buried. As helicopters circle overhead and black SUVs close in from behind, Samuel realizes he's not just running for his life, he's carrying the most dangerous truth in human history. The manuscripts describe a way that challenges everything the world believes about salvation, forgiveness, and the nature of divine love itself. With assassins closing in and nowhere left to hide, Samuel faces an impossible choice: destroy the documents and live, or risk everything to share what Jesus really said on these ancient roads. But what if the truth he's discovered isn't meant for this world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel's boots kicked up small clouds of ancient dust as he forced his exhausted legs to carry him forward. The irony wasn't lost on him. Fleeing for his life down the same path where Jesus had walked with 2 disciples after the resurrection. The manuscripts in his satchel contained their conversation from that very journey, word for word, recorded by someone who had been there. The helicopter's rhythmic thrum grew louder. Samuel pressed himself against a crumbling stone wall that had probably witnessed countless travelers over the millennia. His heart hammered against his ribs as he fought to control his breathing. They were getting closer. It had started 3 weeks ago in a cave system beneath Emmaus that most archaeologists had written off as empty. Samuel's graduate student, Rachel, had noticed irregularities in the geological surveys. While the team focused on the more promising sites, Samuel had explored the forgotten caverns alone. What he found changed everything. The manuscripts were perfectly preserved, wrapped in oiled leather and sealed in clay jars. The Aramaic script was unmistakable, 1st century, authentic, and written by someone with intimate knowledge of Jesus' actual words. But it was the content that made Samuel's hands tremble as he first translated the ancient text. Jesus hadn't spoken about founding a church or establishing religious hierarchies. He talked about an inner transformation, a direct connection to the divine that required no intermediaries, no institutions, no elaborate ceremonies. The way he described was radically simple yet profound: love expressed through action, forgiveness that healed both giver and receiver, and an understanding of God's nature that transcended human concepts of judgment and punishment. The sound of vehicles approaching made Samuel's blood freeze. Through a gap in the wall, he saw the convoy of black SUVs moving methodically up the road, windows tinted, antennas bristling. Professional, deadly. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Give us the documents. Last warning." Samuel deleted the message and powered off the phone. They'd been tracking him electronically until he ditched his car an hour ago. Now they had to hunt him the old-fashioned way, but their resources seemed unlimited. He thought about Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, his mentor at Oxford, who had died in what authorities called a heart attack just 2 days after Samuel had shared his preliminary findings with her. Then Father Miguel Santos, the progressive Catholic theologian who'd been excited to examine the texts, found dead in his Vatican apartment, apparently from a fall, and Professor David Goldstein from Hebrew University, who'd suffered a sudden and fatal allergic reaction to shellfish despite having no known allergies. The pattern was clear, even if the methods varied. Someone with serious power wanted these manuscripts to disappear, along with anyone who knew about them. Samuel pulled out one of the fragile papyrus sheets and read the familiar words he'd translated. "The kingdom of heaven is not a place you go after death, but a way of being alive right now." When you truly forgive, you touch eternity. When you love without conditions, you become what you seek. Revolutionary words. Dangerous words. Words that could empty cathedrals and bankrupt religious empires built on the promise of exclusive salvation. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its downdraft stirring up a whirlwind of dust and debris. Through the rotor noise, Samuel heard car doors slamming, voices shouting orders in multiple languages. They had him surrounded. He carefully folded the manuscript and slipped it back into the satchel. Whatever happened next, he couldn't let 2,000 years of lies continue. Somewhere in the world, people deserved to know what Jesus had actually taught about love, about forgiveness, about the divine spark that existed within every human heart. Samuel stepped out from behind the wall and began walking toward the approaching figures, the leather satchel held tightly against his chest. The ancient parchment crackled beneath David's gloves as he carefully positioned it under the magnification lens. 3 days had passed since his discovery in the Qumran caves, and sleep had become a stranger. His makeshift laboratory in the basement of the École Biblique buzzed with borrowed equipment, carbon dating apparatus, spectrometers, and imaging technology that cast an eerie blue glow across the stone walls. Brother Francois knocked softly before entering, carrying a tray of coffee and bread. The elderly Dominican had been David's closest ally since his arrival in Jerusalem, one of the few scholars who understood that some discoveries transcended academic boundaries. "You look terrible, mon ami," Francois said, setting the tray beside a stack of reference texts. "When did you last see sunlight?" David rubbed his eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion. The carbon dating results came back an hour ago. "Francois, this manuscript, it's authentic. 1st century. The papyrus, the ink composition, even the dialectical variations in the Aramaic. Everything checks out." The monk's weathered face grew serious. "And the content? That's what terrifies me." David turned back to his translation notes, pages covered in his cramped handwriting. "It's a letter, written by someone who claims to be present during the crucifixion. But the details..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They contradict fundamental aspects of the gospel accounts." Francois moved closer, his scholarly curiosity overriding caution. "In what way?" Before David could respond, his encrypted phone buzzed. Only 5 people had this number, and 3 of them were currently in different time zones. The caller ID showed a blocked number. "Dr. Hartwell." His voice carried the wariness of someone who'd received too many threatening calls since news of his discovery had leaked. "Professor, my name is Elena Vasquez. I'm with the Vatican's Commission for Sacred Archaeology. We need to talk." David's blood chilled. The commission was legendary in archaeological circles, part scholarship, part intelligence operation, entirely ruthless when protecting church interests. "I haven't published anything yet. There's nothing to discuss." "On the contrary, there's everything to discuss. The manuscript you discovered belongs to the church. Canon law is quite clear on artifacts found in territories under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The caves are in Israeli territory. The caves are in disputed territory with complex historical claims. But we're not calling to debate legalities, Professor. We're calling because we believe your life may be in danger." David glanced at Francois, whose face had gone pale. "What kind of danger?" "The kind that befalls scholars who dig too deeply into matters better left buried. Check your email in 10 minutes. The line went dead. Francois crossed himself. "The commission. David, you must be very careful. These are not academics playing scholarly games." David's laptop chimed with an incoming message. The sender's address was a jumble of encrypted characters, but the subject line was clear: "For your consideration." The email contained a single link to a news article from 3 months ago. David's hands trembled as he read the headline, "Renowned Dead Sea Scholar Dies in Jerusalem Car Accident." Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant archaeologist from Oxford, had died when her rental car inexplicably veered off the winding road near Bethany. The article mentioned she'd been researching early Christian texts found in private collections, The investigation had concluded it was an accident, brake failure on a steep descent. "I knew Sarah," David whispered. "We corresponded about textual variants in the Damascus document. She mentioned finding something significant in her last email." Francois gripped his shoulder. "Perhaps you should contact the authorities." "And tell them what?" "That I found a manuscript that might challenge 2,000 years of Christian doctrine, that I think scholars are being killed to keep ancient secrets buried." David laughed bitterly. "They'd think I'm paranoid." But paranoia felt increasingly justified as David recalled other recent deaths in their small academic community. Dr. Marcus Hoffman, found dead in his Berlin apartment after claiming to have decoded previously untranslatable Coptic fragments. Professor James Whitmore, who suffered a fatal heart attack the day before presenting research on Q-source variations. David returned to the manuscript, studying the careful Aramaic script. The letter was signed with a name that made his hands shake. Yehuda bar Shimon, Judas, son of Simon. Not Judas Iscariot, but another Judas entirely, one whose very existence would force scholars to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the inner circle of Jesus. The letter described events surrounding the crucifixion with intimate detail, but painted a picture radically different from canonical accounts. According to this Judas, Jesus had survived the cross, rescued by followers who used a drug to simulate death. The resurrection, the cornerstone of Christian faith, was described as an elaborate deception designed to protect Jesus during his recovery. David stared at the ancient words, feeling the weight of their implications. If authentic, and every test confirmed it was, this document could shatter the foundations of Christianity. Faith would survive, certainly, but the institutional church, with its elaborate hierarchies and accumulated wealth, might not. His phone buzzed again. This time, the message was simple. The commission arrives tomorrow. Choose wisely. The manuscript trembled in David's hands as morning light filtered through his hotel room window in Jerusalem. 3 sleepless hours had passed since he'd first opened the ancient parchment, and each line he translated sent deeper tremors through everything he thought he knew about early Christianity. The Aramaic was archaic, predating even the earliest gospel fragments by decades. But it wasn't the age that made his breath catch, it was the content. The document appeared to be a first-hand account of Jesus' teachings, written by someone who claimed to be present during the Sermon on the Mount. Yet the words bore little resemblance to the familiar beatitudes that had comforted believers for 2 millennia. David's phone buzzed against the nightstand. Sarah Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Tell me you haven't slept either." Her voice carried exhaustion and excitement in equal measure. The carbon dating came back, didn't it? 68 CE, plus or minus 15 years. David, this predates the Gospel of Mark by at least 2 decades. If authentic, this could be the earliest Christian document ever discovered. He set the manuscript down carefully, his hands shaking. "Sarah, I need you to look at something. The translation I've been working on, it's not what we expected." A pause. Different how? Jesus speaks of multiple paths to the divine. He references teachings that sound almost Gnostic. There's mention of secret knowledge, of inner light that doesn't require organized worship. David ran his fingers through his hair. If this is genuine, it suggests the early Christian message was far more diverse than the canonical Gospels indicate. That's not necessarily revolutionary. Scholars have theorized about theological diversity in first-century Christianity for years. But Sarah, there's more. The author describes witnessing Jesus perform what he calls the breathing of souls, some kind of mystical practice involving breathwork and meditation. This isn't the Jesus of Sunday school. This is someone teaching esoteric wisdom traditions. The line went quiet for so long David thought the call had dropped. "Sarah, I'm here." "David, listen to me carefully. Don't discuss this with anyone else until we understand what we're dealing with. I'm catching the next flight to Jerusalem. You're overreacting." "Am I?" 2 hours ago, I received a call from Cardinal Toretti's office in Rome. Somehow they know about the discovery. They're sending a representative to assist with the authentication process. David felt ice form in his stomach. Cardinal Torretti headed the Vatican's Pontifical Biblical Commission, the organization responsible for ensuring archaeological discoveries aligned with church doctrine. Their assistance usually meant suppression. How could they know? We've told no one. That's what worries me. Someone's been watching, David. Be careful who you trust. After ending the call, David stared at the manuscript spread across his desk. The implications were staggering. If authentic, this document could fundamentally challenge how Christians understood their faith's origins. It presented a Jesus who taught universal spiritual principles rather than exclusive religious doctrines, a mystical teacher whose message had been filtered and transformed by later gospel writers to serve the needs of an emerging institutional church. A knock at his door made him jump. Through the peephole, he saw a young man in a hotel uniform holding a breakfast tray. Room service, Professor Rains. I didn't order room service. Complimentary breakfast, sir. From the hotel management. Something in the man's tone felt off. David had stayed at the King David Hotel dozens of times. They'd never sent unsolicited breakfast trays. He quietly gathered the manuscript pages, slipping them into a leather portfolio. Just leave it outside the door, please. Hotel policy requires personal delivery, sir. David's heart rate accelerated. Through the peephole, he noticed the young man's eyes scanning the hallway nervously. Professional paranoia, honed by years of working in politically sensitive regions, kicked in. One moment. He moved to the bathroom window, grateful his room was only on the second floor. The manuscript portfolio went into his shoulder bag along with his laptop and passport. Whatever was happening, he couldn't risk losing the document. The knocking became more insistent. Professor Rains? Sir? David opened the bathroom window and swung his legs over the sill. The limestone ledge was narrow but manageable. He dropped into the hotel's rear courtyard, landing hard but uninjured. Behind him, he heard his room door opening. Moving quickly through Jerusalem's winding streets, David's mind raced. Someone had discovered their find within hours of the initial translation. The implications were clear. He was being watched, probably had been from the moment he'd arrived at the dig site. The manuscript in his bag represented more than academic discovery. It was potentially revolutionary information that powerful institutions would kill to suppress. As he navigated toward the old city, blending into the morning crowds of pilgrims and merchants, David realized his life as a quiet biblical scholar had ended the moment he'd opened that ancient parchment. Some truths he was beginning to understand came with a price higher than he'd ever imagined. The Jerusalem morning air carried the scent of ancient stone and modern exhaust as David hurried through the narrow streets of the old city. His backpack, containing photocopies of the most explosive pages from the Qumran cache, seemed to weigh more with each step. The manuscripts hidden in his hotel safe represented something far more dangerous than academic controversy. They were a powder keg that could shatter 2 millennia of faith. His phone buzzed insistently. Another call from Cardinal Torretti's office in Rome. David let it ring, knowing that every major religious institution would soon be scrambling to either suppress or control his discovery. The fragments he'd uncovered didn't just challenge Christian doctrine, they demolished its very foundation. A shadow detached itself from a doorway ahead. David's pulse quickened as he recognized the same figure who had been following him since yesterday. Broad shoulders, dark sunglasses, the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to violence. David ducked into a crowded marketplace, weaving between vendors hawking everything from prayer shawls to postcards of the Dome of the Rock. The metallic scrape of a knife being drawn made him freeze, not his pursuer, a butcher preparing lamb for the lunch crowd. David's nerves were fraying faster than he'd anticipated. He needed allies, but Dr. Sarah Chen's encrypted message from the night before had been clear: trust no one from the established archaeological community. Too many careers, too much money, too much power at stake. Threading through the market's maze, David emerged near the Western Wall. Pilgrims pressed against the ancient stones, many weeping as they touched what they believed was all that remained of Solomon's temple. If they knew what David knew about the historical Jesus, about what those manuscripts really said, would they still pray with such fervor? His phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Garden Tomb, 20 minutes, come alone. David's hands trembled as he read the message. The Garden Tomb sat outside the old city walls, an alternative site where some believed Jesus had been buried and resurrected. Unlike the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it felt authentically first century, a simple cave carved from rock, surrounded by a garden that could have existed in Jesus' time. The walk took him through Damascus Gate, past vendors selling fresh bread and strong coffee to tourists beginning their biblical journeys. David's mind raced through possibilities. Who had his number? Who knew about his discovery? The manuscripts had been sealed in that cave for nearly 2,000 years. Only a handful of people knew he'd found them. The Garden Tomb's entrance appeared ahead, flanked by ancient olive trees whose gnarled branches had weathered countless storms. David paid the modest entrance fee, noting how the elderly gatekeeper's eyes seemed to linger on his face a moment too long. Recognition or paranoia? Inside the garden, Protestant pilgrims gathered around their guide, who gestured toward the tomb entrance while explaining why this site, not the Holy Sepulchre, represented the true location of Christ's burial. David almost laughed at the irony. If his manuscripts were authentic, both sites were monuments to a magnificent fiction. Dr. David Harper. David spun toward the voice. A woman emerged from behind the tomb, mid-40s, athletic build, wearing the practical clothes of someone who spent time in the field. Her Arabic accent was slight but unmistakable. "Dr. Layla Mansour," she said, extending her hand. "I knew your father." David's breath caught. His father had died 10 years ago in Syria, supposedly researching early Christian communities. Officially, it was a heart attack. Unofficially, David had always suspected there was more to the story. "We need to talk about what you found," Layla continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "and about why your father really died." The tour group moved away from the tomb, their voices fading as they discussed resurrection theology. David followed Layla into the cave itself, a simple chamber carved from living rock with a stone shelf where a body might once have lain. "Your manuscripts," Layla said, her voice echoing softly off the walls. "They're not the first to surface. Your father found similar texts. He was getting close to something that certain people couldn't allow to become public." David's legs felt weak. What kind of people? The kind who spent centuries ensuring that history serves their purposes. Layla pulled out a weathered photograph showing his father standing beside archaeological excavation in what looked like southern Syria. Religious institutions aren't the only ones with stakes in this game. Governments, intelligence agencies, organizations you've never heard of, they all have reasons to keep certain truths buried. Through the tomb's entrance, David could see Jerusalem's ancient walls rising in the distance. Somewhere in that city, people who had killed his father were probably planning David's own elimination. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Layla's expression was grim but determined. "To finish what your father started. To make sure these manuscripts see daylight before someone ensures they disappear forever. And if we fail," she gestured toward the empty tomb around them, "then we join the ranks of those whose stories were rewritten by the victors." The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Jerusalem's old city as David Chen made his way through the winding alleys toward the Armenian Quarter. His conversation with Father Moretti had left him more unsettled than he cared to admit. The priest's warning echoed in his mind. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cool morning air and checked his watch. Rabbi Sarah Goldstein had agreed to meet him at the ancient library housed within the Armenian Patriarchate, a repository of texts that few scholars ever gained access to. If anyone could shed light on the mysterious fragments he'd discovered, it would be Sarah. Her expertise in Second Temple period Judaism was unparalleled, and more importantly, he trusted her. The narrow passage opened into a small courtyard where Sarah waited beside an ornate wooden door. Her silver hair caught the morning light, and her keen eyes immediately assessed his disheveled appearance. "You look terrible, David," she said without preamble. "When you called last night, you sounded like you'd seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he replied, embracing her briefly. "Thank you for arranging this. I know how difficult it is to gain access here." Sarah produced an ancient key from her robes. "The advantages of 40 years of relationship building. Brother Hagop owes me several favors." She unlocked the door, and they stepped into a dimly lit corridor lined with centuries-old manuscripts. The air smelled of parchment and time itself. They walked deeper into the library, past shelves that held texts in Armenian Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Sarah led him to a secluded reading room where natural light filtered through a small window. She gestured for him to sit at a wooden table scarred by decades of scholarly work. "Now," she said, settling across from him, "tell me what has you so troubled." David hesitated for a moment, then reached into his bag and withdrew the carefully wrapped fragments. As he unveiled them, Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment. "Oh my God," she whispered, leaning forward. "Where did you find these?" "A hidden chamber beneath Capernaum." "Sarah, I think these might be contemporary to Jesus himself. Look at the Aramaic here, and this," he pointed to a particular passage. "This appears to describe events that aren't in the canonical Gospels." Sarah put on her reading glasses and examined the fragments with the reverence of someone who understood their potential significance. Her fingers hovered over the ancient text without quite touching it. "The paleography is consistent with 1st century, she murmured. "But David, do you understand what you're suggesting? Contemporary accounts of Jesus are virtually non-existent outside the Gospels, and those were written decades after his death." "I know. That's what makes this so extraordinary and so dangerous." Sarah looked up sharply. "Dangerous how?" David told her about the break-in at his apartment, the man in the cathedral, and Father Moretti's warnings about the Vatican's concerns. As he spoke, Sarah's expression grew increasingly grave. "There's something else," David continued. He showed her the passage that had kept him awake all night. "This section here describes a teaching that contradicts fundamental Christian doctrine about the nature of divinity." Sarah studied the text carefully, her lips moving silently as she translated. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, looking shaken. "If this is authentic, it would challenge the very foundations of Christian theology," she said quietly. "The implications are staggering. That's why I need your help. I need to know if this could be real, or if someone has created an elaborate forgery." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, studying the fragments from different angles. Finally, she spoke. "The papyrus appears genuine, and the writing style is consistent with the period. But David, authentication of something this significant would require extensive testing. Carbon dating, spectral analysis, comparison with known contemporary texts, all of which would expose what we've found to others." "Exactly. And if certain parties are already concerned about your discoveries..." She left the sentence hanging. David rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the decision before him. "What would you do?" "I would remember that truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful forces try to suppress it." Sarah carefully rewrapped the fragments. "But I would also remember that martyrdom rarely serves the cause of scholarship." A sound in the corridor outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching their reading room. Sarah quickly secured the fragments and motioned for David to remain silent. The footsteps paused outside their door. David could see a shadow through the gap beneath it. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps continued down the hallway. Sarah waited another minute before speaking in a whisper. "David, I think it's time you considered the possibility that your discovery has already attracted more attention than you realize." As if summoned by her words, David's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me at the Garden of Gethsemane at sunset. Come alone. A friend." The narrow street twisted through Jerusalem's Christian quarter like a serpent's spine, shadows pooling between ancient stones that had witnessed 2 millennia of pilgrims, conquerors, and seekers. David pressed his back against the cool limestone wall of a medieval church, his breath coming in short bursts as footsteps echoed from the alley behind him. 3 hours had passed since he'd fled his hotel room, clutching only his leather satchel containing the photographs of the manuscripts. The men who'd been watching him had made their move at dawn, but years of navigating dangerous excavation sites had taught him to trust his instincts. He'd slipped out through the service entrance while they waited in the lobby. Now, as morning light filtered through the narrow gaps between buildings, he needed to find sanctuary somewhere they wouldn't think to look. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was seeking refuge in the very city where his discoveries might shake the foundations of faith itself. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, a woman in a dark hijab, moving with purposeful steps. David tensed, ready to run, but she approached with her hands visible and empty. "Dr. Brennan?" Her accent was local, educated. "I am Layla Nasser. Dr. Khalil sent me." The name stopped him cold. Ahmad Khalil had been his mentor during his graduate studies, a brilliant archaeologist who disappeared into academic obscurity after publishing controversial papers about early Christian texts. David hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. "Ahmad is here. In Jerusalem?" "Not here. But he knows what you found." Her dark eyes were serious, urgent. "He says the manuscripts you discovered are not the first. There have been others scattered across the region for centuries. Some have been destroyed, others hidden away by those who fear their implications." David's mind raced. How does he know about my discovery? Word travels quickly in our community, especially when Vatican officials begin making discreet inquiries about missing artifacts from Syrian dig sites. She glanced nervously down the alley. "We should not remain here. There are ears everywhere in the old city." She led him through a maze of back streets, past vendors setting up their morning wares and early tourists already clutching guidebooks. The familiar sounds and smells of the ancient city, cardamom coffee, fresh bread, the distant call to prayer, should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like a soundtrack to his growing paranoia. They descended stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, entering what appeared to be a small antiquities shop. But Layla continued past the displayed pottery and coins, through a curtained doorway into a back room, lined with books and scrolls. An elderly man sat hunched over a magnifying glass, examining what looked like fragments of papyrus. When he looked up, David felt a jolt of recognition despite the years that had etched deeper lines around Ahmad's eyes. "David." His former mentor rose slowly, embracing him. "You look like a man who has seen ghosts. I feel like I'm living with them." David set down his satchel, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming him. "Ahmad, what I've found, it's not just another early Christian text. It suggests that fundamental aspects of the resurrection narrative were later additions, political constructions designed to establish authority." "Yes, I suspected as much." Ahmad gestured to the papyrus fragments on his desk. "These came to me 6 months ago from a dealer in Damascus. They're part of what appears to be a larger collection. Letters between early Christian communities discussing what should and should not be included in their growing body of sacred literature." David leaned over the fragments, his trained eye immediately recognizing the significance of the script and content. "This is from the late 1st century? Perhaps earlier. The implications are considerable." Ahmad's voice carried the weight of years spent grappling with uncomfortable truths. "There have been others like you, David, scholars who found pieces of this puzzle. Some have been discredited, others have simply disappeared from academic circles. A few have died under mysterious circumstances." The room fell silent, except for the muffled sounds of the shop beyond the curtain. David felt the walls of his ordered academic world continuing to crumble. Who's behind this? The Vatican? Some other religious authority? "The truth has many enemies," Layla interjected. Not just Christian authorities, any organization whose power depends on unquestioned faith has reason to fear what you've uncovered. Ahmad returned to his desk, carefully covering the papyrus fragments with cloth. The question now is what you intend to do with your knowledge. Publication will bring scrutiny you may not survive, but silence makes you complicit in perpetuating what may be history's greatest deception. David thought of the faces of every student he'd taught, every believer whose world would be shattered by these revelations. Then he thought of the pursuit that had driven him from his hotel room, the men who would kill to keep these secrets buried. "I need to see everything," he said finally. "All the fragments, all the evidence. If I'm going to risk my life for the truth, I want to be certain it's complete." Ahmad nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "Then we have work to do." The ancient stone steps leading to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre felt different beneath David's feet this time. Where once he had climbed them with academic curiosity, now each step carried the weight of dangerous knowledge. The manuscript fragment in his satchel seemed to pulse against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Sarah walked beside him, her photographer's eye constantly scanning the crowd of pilgrims and tourists. They had agreed to meet Father Antonio here, in the most public of sacred spaces, hoping the crowds would provide both cover and protection. But as they approached the entrance, David noticed the same face he'd seen 3 times since leaving their hotel, a thin man in a blue jacket who seemed far too interested in his phone. "We're being followed," Sarah murmured, adjusting her camera strap. "I know. The question is by whom?" Inside the church, the familiar smell of incense and centuries-old stone wrapped around them like a shroud. Pilgrims knelt in prayer before the stone of anointing, their whispered words creating a susurrus of devotion that had echoed in this space for over 1,000 years. David wondered how many of them would continue their worship if they knew what he carried. They found Father Antonio in the Chapel of Adam, standing before the glass-encased crack in the rock that tradition claimed reached down to where Adam's skull lay buried beneath Golgotha. The priest's usual calm demeanor was strained, his fingers working nervously at his rosary. "You came," Antonio said without turning around. "I wasn't certain you would. You said it was urgent," David replied, positioning himself so he could watch the chapel entrance. Antonio finally faced them, and David was struck by how much the man seemed to have aged since their last meeting. Deep lines etched his face, and his eyes held a haunted quality. "I've been making inquiries about your manuscript," Antonio began quietly. "Discreet inquiries through channels I've cultivated over decades in biblical scholarship. What I learned..." He paused, crossing himself. "David, you're not the first person to discover fragments of what you found." Sarah stepped closer, her hand instinctively moving toward her camera. "What do you mean?" 1967, Antonio continued. "A team of archaeologists working in the Judean desert found similar fragments. The lead archaeologist was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a brilliant woman, a devout Catholic. Like you, David, she believed scholarship should serve truth above all else." David felt his stomach clench. What happened to her? Officially, a tragic accident. Her car went off a cliff road near Jerusalem, but her assistant, who survived, claimed they were being followed. More importantly, the fragments they discovered vanished from the secured university vault the night before her death. The chapel suddenly felt smaller, the weight of stone and history pressing down on them. David glanced around, noting how the shadows seemed deeper, how every figure in the periphery could be a threat. "There were others," Antonio went on. 1983, a monk in Egypt. 1996, a professor in Rome. Each time someone gets close to pieces of the same puzzle you're assembling, and each time..." He didn't need to finish. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Who's doing this?" Antonio's laugh was bitter. "That's the question, isn't it? The Vatican has its secrets, yes, but this goes deeper. There are forces within the church and outside it that have been protecting certain narratives for centuries. They call themselves guardians of faith, but they're really guardians of power. A flash of blue caught David's eye. The thin man from the street had entered the chapel, moving with casual purpose toward a pillar near the altar. David's pulse quickened. "We need to leave," he said quietly. Antonio nodded. "There's something else. Your friend Marcus, the one who helped you with the initial translation, he sent word through mutual contacts. He's discovered the location where he believes the rest of the manuscripts are hidden, a site in the Galilee near Capernaum." David felt the world shift around him. The rest of the manuscripts, if what they'd already found could rewrite Christian history, what would the complete collection reveal? "Marcus is frightened," Antonio continued. "He won't communicate directly anymore, won't use phones or email, but he left a message. He'll be at the site tomorrow night during the new moon. He says it's the only chance. After that, he's disappearing." The thin man had moved closer, now examining a Byzantine mosaic with feigned interest. Two other figures had entered the chapel, positioning themselves near the exits. "Back exit," David whispered urgently. They moved as naturally as possible, Antonio leading them through a side passage that connected to the older sections of the church. Behind them, David heard the subtle shift of movement as their watchers realized their quarry was moving. The passage opened into a small courtyard where Ethiopian Orthodox monks maintained their ancient claim to a portion of the Holy Sepulchre. Antonio stopped at a worn wooden door. "This leads to the Ethiopian monastery," he said. "They'll help you reach the street safely, but David," he gripped the scholar's shoulder, "whatever you decide about Galilee, remember that some truths exact a price higher than death. They can destroy the faith of millions." The monastery's ancient stones seemed to whisper secrets as Dr. Samuel Cross made his way through the pre-dawn darkness. Brother Marcus had left a cryptic note under his door, the vault below the scriptorium. "Come alone, trust no one else." Now, descending narrow stone steps that had worn smooth under centuries of sandaled feet, Samuel felt the weight of history pressing down on him like the mountain itself. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the musty scent of parchment and time. A single torch flickered at the bottom, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with wooden shelves that stretched into darkness. But it wasn't Brother Marcus waiting for him in the vault. Dr. Cross. The voice belonged to a woman, her accent cultured but unplaceable. She stepped into the torchlight, revealing sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate his worth in milliseconds. "I apologize for the deception, but circumstances demanded discretion." Samuel's hand instinctively moved toward the satchel containing the manuscripts. "Where's Brother Marcus?" "Safe, for now." She gestured to the shelves around them. "Do you know what this place truly is? The monks believe it's merely storage for damaged texts. In reality, it's one of the last remaining repositories of the Corpus Veritatis, documents the Church has spent 2 millennia either destroying or burying." The name sent ice through Samuel's veins. The Corpus Veritatis was legend among biblical scholars, rumored to contain the earliest Christian writings, including texts that contradicted established doctrine. Most academics dismissed it as fantasy. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Someone who's been waiting a very long time for you to find what you found." She moved to one of the shelves, running her fingers along ancient spines. "The manuscript you carry, it's not unique. There are others, fragments scattered across hidden libraries from Ethiopia to Tibet. But yours contains the key. The key to what? To understanding that everything the world believes about Christ's mission, his words, his very identity, has been deliberately obscured." Her voice carried a passion that reminded him of his own academic fervor, but darker, more desperate. "Tell me, Doctor, what did you make of the passage about the true kingdom?" Samuel's breath caught. He hadn't shared that specific detail with anyone except Brother Marcus. The passage she referenced was among the most troubling in the manuscript, suggesting Christ's message had been fundamentally political rather than spiritual. A call to overthrow not just Rome, but the entire structure of earthly power. "You've been watching me. We've been protecting you." She pulled a scroll from the shelf, its leather wrapping cracked with age. 3 days ago, agents of the Vatican's archive entered Syria. Yesterday, a team from the Antiquities Authority was found dead near Qumran. You think it's coincidence that you're still breathing? The torch flame guttered, throwing wild shadows across the vault. Samuel felt the walls closing in, not just stone walls, but the weight of forces beyond his comprehension. What do you want from me? To finish what you started, to follow the trail where it leads, regardless of the consequences. She held out the scroll. This contains references to a site near Capernaum, a place where the original disciples hid documents after the crucifixion, documents that make your manuscript look like a footnote. Samuel stared at the offered scroll, knowing that taking it would cross a line from which there might be no return. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow you'll read about your tragic accident in the Jerusalem Post. A foreign scholar, overcome by the desert heat, wandering off sacred paths. Her smile held no warmth. The church has perfected such narratives over the centuries. Above them, footsteps echoed through the monastery's corridors. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. The woman's expression sharpened. Choose quickly, Doctor. Your academic friends have arrived earlier than expected. Samuel's mind raced. Everything he'd dedicated his life to, the pursuit of historical truth, the careful reconstruction of ancient faith, hung in the balance. The manuscripts in his satchel represented either the greatest archaeological discovery of the century or a path to his own destruction. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking in rapid Italian. He took the scroll. "There's another way out," the woman whispered, leading him toward what appeared to be solid stone. Her hand found a hidden mechanism, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a tunnel that disappeared into blackness. "This leads to the old quarry. A car is waiting. How do I know you're not leading me into a trap? Because, Dr. Cross, if we wanted you dead, you'd already be sharing a grave with Brother Marcus." The blood drained from Samuel's face. Above them, the voices grew urgent. Commands barked in the sharp tones of men accustomed to immediate obedience. Without another word, he plunged into the tunnel's embrace, following the mysterious woman into darkness while clutching documents that might rewrite 2,000 years of human faith. Behind them, the monastery erupted into shouts of anger and pursuit. The hunt had truly begun. The narrow alleyway behind the Damascus gate reeked of refuse and desperation. Dr. Samuel Hartwell pressed himself against the cold stone wall, his heart hammering as footsteps echoed from the main thoroughfare. 3 days had passed since the monastery attack, and every shadow seemed to conceal another threat. Miriam emerged from a doorway 20 feet ahead, her hijab pulled low over her face. She moved with practiced stealth, checking corners before signaling him forward. They had been moving through Jerusalem's old city like ghosts, using safe houses provided by her network of academic contacts and sympathetic locals. "The Vatican delegation arrived this morning," she whispered as they ducked into another alcove. "Cardinal Torretti himself is here." Samuel's blood ran cold. Antonio Torretti was the church's chief theologian, a man whose influence reached into the highest echelons of Catholic doctrine. His presence meant the manuscripts had triggered alarms at the very top of the Vatican hierarchy. "How long before they find us?" "Not long, but I have news." Miriam's eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I made contact with Dr. Khalil at the Israeli Antiquities Authority. He's willing to examine the manuscripts, but only if we can get them to him safely." Samuel clutched the leather satchel closer to his chest. Inside were photocopies of the most explosive documents he had ever encountered. Texts that suggested Jesus had survived the crucifixion, that the resurrection was a carefully constructed narrative, that the foundations of Christianity were built on deliberate mythology. A black sedan crawled past the alley entrance, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Both scholars froze until it disappeared. "There's something else," Miriam continued. "Before Father Andreas died, he managed to send a message to Dr. Khalil. The monastery had more manuscripts, dozens of them. They were moved before the attack." "Moved where?" That's what we need to find out. Andreas mentioned a place called the Repository of Last Things. Khalil thinks it might be connected to an old Templar site in the Judean desert. The sound of boots on stone made them both tense. A patrol of Israeli police was conducting routine sweeps, but in their current situation, any law enforcement contact could prove fatal. The wrong people had too much influence, too many resources. They waited in silence as the patrol passed, then moved deeper into the labyrinth of ancient streets. The weight of 2,000 years of history pressed down on Samuel's shoulders. Every stone they passed had witnessed the birth and evolution of the world's largest religion, and now he carried evidence that could shatter that foundation. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly as they paused near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The irony wasn't lost on him, hiding in the shadow of Christianity's most sacred site while carrying documents that challenged its very core. Miriam was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather was a Palestinian Christian. He used to tell me stories about the early days, before the politics and the violence consumed everything. He believed that truth was sacred, regardless of the consequences. He said that faith built on lies wasn't faith at all." A commotion erupted from the direction they had come. Shouting voices, car doors slamming. Their pursuers were getting closer. "This way." Miriam led him through a narrow passage that opened onto the Via Dolorosa. Tourists clustered around their guide, following the traditional path of Christ's final journey. Samuel felt the crushing weight of irony. Here were faithful pilgrims walking a road their Savior might never have traveled, at least not in the way they believed. They blended into the crowd, heads down, moving with the flow of tourists and pilgrims. Samuel's mind raced through the implications of what they had discovered. If the manuscripts were authentic, if Jesus had indeed survived and lived out his days in obscurity, what did that mean for billions of believers? What did it mean for Western civilization itself? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We know what you have. Return the documents and no one else dies. You have 24 hours. Miriam read the message over his shoulder, her face pale. Father Andreas wasn't the first, was he? Samuel shook his head grimly. Dr. Elizabeth Chen in Berlin, Professor Marcus Webb in London. Both had been investigating similar historical anomalies before their accidents. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone was systematically eliminating scholars who got too close to these particular truths. Dr. Khalil is waiting for us at the Rockefeller Museum, Miriam said. But if we're going to make this work, we need to split up. They're looking for a pair. Samuel nodded, though every instinct screamed against separating. Miriam had become his anchor in this nightmare, the one person he could trust in a world where ancient secrets commanded modern violence. If something happens to me, he said, pressing a flash drive into her hand, make sure these documents see the light of day, whatever the cost. The crowd carried them toward their destiny, two small figures in an ancient city where truth and myth had always danced their deadly waltz. The monastery's stone walls seemed to breathe with ancient secrets as Dr. Samuel Hartwell followed Brother Marcus through corridors, lit only by flickering candles. Each footstep echoed like a heartbeat in the pre-dawn darkness, reminding Samuel that he was walking deeper into a world where faith and scholarship collided with deadly force. The manuscripts you seek are not the only treasures hidden here, Brother Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant chanting of morning prayers. But they are perhaps the most dangerous. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the leather satchel containing the fragments he'd already discovered. The Aramaic text still burned in his mind, words that suggested Jesus had spoken of his mission in terms that contradicted 2 millennia of Christian doctrine. If authentic, these documents didn't just challenge church teaching, they demolished it. They descended a narrow spiral staircase carved directly into the monastery's foundation. The air grew thick and musty, carrying the scent of aged parchment and something else, fear perhaps, or the weight of secrets kept too long. Professor Hartwell, Brother Marcus stopped suddenly, his weathered face grave in the candlelight. Before we proceed, you must understand. The men who killed your colleague Professor Chen are not mere extremists. They represent interests that span centuries, organizations that have shaped history itself to protect certain interpretations. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. You know who killed David? I know enough to realize you're in greater danger than you comprehend. The Custodes Fidei, the guardians of faith, they call themselves. They've existed in various forms since the Council of Nicaea, ensuring that certain documents never see daylight, that certain questions never get asked. The name sent chills down Samuel's spine. He'd heard whispers of such a group in academic circles, dismissed as conspiracy theory by most scholars. But David's brutal murder had shattered any illusion of academic immunity from real-world consequences. They reached the bottom of the stairs, where Brother Marcus produced an ornate key from beneath his robes. The lock it opened looked centuries old, yet the mechanism turned smoothly, as if regularly maintained. The chamber beyond contains texts that survived the Great Purges, Brother Marcus explained. Documents that certain Roman emperors, certain popes, certain kings ordered destroyed. Monks have died to preserve what lies within. The heavy door swung open to reveal a small room lined floor to ceiling with ancient scrolls, codices, and bound manuscripts. Samuel's breath caught. This was every biblical scholar's dream and nightmare. The sheer volume of potentially paradigm-shifting material was overwhelming. How long has this collection existed? Samuel asked, his voice hushed with reverence. Since the 4th century, when Constantine's newly unified church began deciding which Gospels would be canonical and which would be forgotten. The monks here chose to remember. Samuel approached the shelves with trembling hands. Many texts appeared to be in Coptic, others in Greek, some in languages he couldn't immediately identify. But then he saw them, scrolls with the distinctive Aramaic script he'd been following. These, he pointed to a collection of 7 scrolls bound in faded purple silk. Are these the testimonies of the 12? Accounts written by Jesus' actual disciples, not the sanitized versions that became our canonical Gospels. They speak of a teacher, yes, but not quite the divine figure Christianity constructed. Samuel's hands shook as he carefully unbound the silk. The first scroll was remarkably preserved, the text clear and readable. As his eyes scanned the ancient words, his theological worldview began crumbling. The disciple Thomas wrote of Jesus speaking in parables about human potential, about the divine spark within every person waiting to be awakened. There was no mention of blood sacrifice for sin, no claims of unique divine sonship. Instead, Jesus appeared as a radical teacher, showing others how to achieve the same spiritual insights he had attained. My God, Samuel whispered, if these are authentic. Christianity as the world knows it becomes a beautiful lie built on political necessity, Brother Marcus finished. Constantine needed a unifying religion for his empire. The bishops needed authority over their flocks. The Jesus of these texts, a teacher of enlightenment rather than a sacrifice for sin, serves neither purpose. Footsteps echoed from the stairway above. Brother Marcus's face went pale. They've found us, he hissed. Quickly, take what you can carry. Samuel grabbed 3 of the scrolls, stuffing them into his satchel alongside his other findings. Is there another way out? Through the catacombs, but it's dangerous. The tunnels connect to the old city, but parts have collapsed. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking in sharp, clipped tones. Samuel recognized one accent as American, another as German. The Custodes Fidei had indeed found them. Lead the way, Samuel said, following Brother Marcus toward a nearly invisible door carved into the chamber's back wall. As they slipped into the darkness beyond, Samuel realized he was no longer just a scholar seeking truth. He had become a guardian of secrets that could reshape human understanding of faith itself. The hunt was far from over. The ancient stone steps echoed with their hurried footsteps as Marcus and Elena descended into the bowels of the monastery. Brother Matthias led them through a labyrinth of corridors carved from living rock, his torch casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed 1,000 years of secrets. "The abbot is waiting," Matthias whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "He says the manuscripts you seek have awakened things that should have remained sleeping." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. After 3 days of following fragments and whispers across the Judean hills, they had finally traced the remaining codices to this remote Orthodox monastery perched on a cliff face east of Bethlehem. But the monk's words carried an ominous weight that made his skin crawl. The passage opened into a circular chamber lit by oil lamps, arranged in careful patterns. At its center sat an elderly man whose long white beard reached nearly to his lap. His eyes, bright as polished obsidian, fixed on Marcus with unsettling intensity. "Dr. Thorne," the abbot said in accented English, "you have been asking dangerous questions in dangerous times." "I'm a scholar seeking truth," Marcus replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Nothing more." The abbot's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Nothing more? Brother, you carry documents that Vatican agents and Israeli intelligence would kill for. Men have already died because of what you found." Elena stepped closer to Marcus. "We just want to understand what the manuscripts contain. If they're authentic..." "Authentic?" The abbot rose, his robes rustling in the lamplight. "Child, authenticity is not the question. The question is whether humanity is ready for certain truths." He moved to a stone alcove and withdrew a metal box, its surface covered in symbols Marcus recognized as early Christian iconography mixed with older, pre-Christian markings. The abbot's hands trembled slightly as he set it on the altar. "These came to us in 1947, the same year as Qumran. A Bedouin shepherd brought them here instead of to the archaeologists, claiming they were cursed. My predecessor hid them, thinking it was superstition." The old man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We have learned otherwise." Marcus felt his breath catch. "You have the missing fragments?" "Fragments, yes. But more than that. We have the testimony of Yehuda bar Simon." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. According to early church records, Yehuda bar Simon had been one of Jesus' closest disciples, closer even than the canonical 12. But his writings had been declared heretical and supposedly destroyed in the 4th century. "That's impossible," Elena breathed. "Those texts were lost forever." The abbot opened the box with careful reverence. Inside, wrapped in silk, lay 3 papyrus scrolls in remarkably good condition. Yehuda wrote these in the weeks following the crucifixion. They contain difficult truths. Marcus stepped forward, his scholar's instincts overriding his caution. "What kind of truths?" "The kind that would shatter 2,000 years of faith if they became public." The abbot's eyes met his. "Tell me, Dr. Thorne, in your research, have you found any mention of Jesus having children?" The question struck like lightning. Marcus felt Elena's sharp intake of breath beside him. This was the theory that had gotten scholars excommunicated, that had fueled centuries of speculation and conspiracy. "There are suggestions in some apocryphal texts," Marcus said carefully, "but nothing concrete." The abbot nodded toward the scrolls. Yehuda was there. He witnessed the marriage ceremony in Bethany. He knew Mary of Magdala not as a repentant sinner, but as Jesus' wife, the mother of his son. The chamber fell into heavy silence. Marcus felt the weight of revelation pressing down on him like the stone ceiling above. If this was true, if there was documentary evidence, "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because others already know. The Vatican's secret archives contain fragments. Certain Jewish scholars have pieces. Even some Islamic texts hint at it. The truth exists in scattered pieces across the world, and powerful people will do anything to keep it scattered." Elena found her voice. "But why? Why is this so threatening?" The abbot's smile was sad. "Because it makes Jesus fully human, a teacher, a prophet perhaps, but not the divine figure Christianity requires. It suggests his bloodline continued, that somewhere in the world his descendants might still live." Marcus's mind raced with implications. The political ramifications alone would be staggering. The religious earthquake would reshape 3 major faiths. And if there were living descendants? Who else knows you have these? He asked urgently. The abbot's expression darkened. We thought no one. But yesterday, strangers were seen in the valley below, armed men asking about ancient manuscripts. A sound echoed from the corridors above. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Brother Matthias burst into the chamber, his face pale with terror. "Father Abbot, armed men at the gates. They demand entrance." The old man moved with surprising speed, pressing the scrolls into Marcus's hands. "There is another way out, but you must choose quickly. Flee with this knowledge or stay and let it die with us." The ancient stone steps of the monastery of St. Catherine seemed to whisper warnings with each footfall as Dr. Marcus Webb climbed toward the library that had guarded secrets for over 15 centuries. His ribs ached from yesterday's encounter with Touretti's men in Jerusalem, but the manuscript fragments in his leather satchel drove him forward despite the pain. Brother Dimitri waited at the heavy wooden doors, his weathered face grave in the pre-dawn darkness. "You should not have come here, Dr. Webb. They arrived 3 hours ago, asking questions about you." Marcus felt his blood chill. "Ooh, men with expensive suits and dangerous eyes. I told them nothing, but they will return." The monk's gnarled fingers worked nervously at his prayer beads. "What you seek, it may cost more than you are willing to pay." Inside the library, dust motes danced in shafts of early sunlight, streaming through high windows. Ancient texts lined the walls, their spines bearing the weight of millennia. Marcus spread the manuscript fragments carefully on a wooden reading table, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged the pieces of parchment that had already cost 3 lives. "These symbols here," he pointed to a section of Aramaic text, "they reference a document called the True Testimony. Have you seen anything like this in your archives?" Brother Dimitri leaned closer, his breath sharp with recognition. "Mother of God." He crossed himself quickly. "Follow me." They descended deeper into the monastery's heart, past chambers Marcus had never seen. The air grew thick and cool, heavy with the scent of ancient parchment and frankincense. In a vault behind the main collection, Dimitri retrieved a metal box from a hidden alcove. "This came to us in 1844, the same year Constantine Tischendorf discovered the Codex Sinaiticus here. But we kept this one secret." His hands shook as he lifted the lid. "Perhaps we should have burned it." The document inside made Marcus's breath catch. Written in the same hand as his fragments, it bore the unmistakable mark of first-century scribes. But as he read the opening lines, his academic excitement transformed into cold dread. "This cannot be authentic," he whispered, though every fiber of his expertise told him it was genuine. The text spoke of events that contradicted fundamental Christian doctrine, not through denial but through a different telling that painted familiar stories in radically new light. Names he recognized appeared in contexts that would shatter faith and topple institutions. "Now you understand why some knowledge remains buried," Dimitri said softly. "This truth would not liberate, it would destroy." A sound echoed from the monastery's upper levels, footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Marcus quickly photographed the document with his phone, his heart hammering as voices drifted down from above. "They have found us," Dimitri whispered. "There is another way out, but you must choose quickly. Take this knowledge and run, or stay and let them bury it with you." Marcus gathered the manuscripts, his mind reeling from their implications. Everything he had believed about the origins of Christianity, everything the world accepted as historical fact, crumbled before the evidence in his hands. These were not the writings of later critics or revisionist scholars. These were contemporary accounts that rang with the authenticity of eyewitness testimony. "Dr. Webb!" The voice echoed down from the main library, cultured and cold. "We know you're here. Let's discuss this like civilized men." Touretti, the Vatican's fixer, had followed him even here, to this sacred sanctuary that had preserved knowledge through the rise and fall of empires. Marcus thought of Professor Hendricks, murdered for pursuing the same truth, of Sarah, disappeared somewhere in the labyrinth of conspiracy surrounding these documents. "This way." Dimitri urged, leading him toward a narrow passage carved into the living rock. These tunnels connect to the burning bush sanctuary. From there, you can reach the desert. As they moved through the darkness, Marcus's phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made him stop short. Sarah was alive, hidden in a safe house in Cairo, but Toretti held leverage that would force her into the open. The message was clear: surrender the manuscripts or watch more innocent people die. They emerged into blinding sunlight near the chapel that marked the traditional site of Moses' encounter with the divine. The irony was not lost on Marcus. Here, where God had supposedly revealed himself through flame, he held documents that might rewrite humanity's understanding of divine revelation itself. "Go," Dimitri pressed urgently. "I will delay them as long as possible." Marcus clasped the monk's shoulder, understanding that this brave man would likely pay dearly for his assistance. The weight of the manuscripts in his satchel felt enormous, each page a potential catalyst for global upheaval. As he disappeared into the Sinai wilderness, following paths worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims seeking truth, Marcus realized he faced an impossible choice. The scholar in him demanded that knowledge be shared, regardless of consequences. But the human in him understood that some revelations could tear civilization apart at its very foundations. Behind him, shouts erupted from the monastery as his hunters discovered his escape route. The ancient stone steps of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre felt cold beneath Daniel's feet as he descended into the depths beneath Jerusalem's most sacred site. Brother Marcus led the way, his robes rustling in the narrow passage, lit only by battery-powered lanterns. The weight of centuries pressed down on them as they moved deeper into chambers that had remained hidden from the world for over a millennium. "Few have walked these passages," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing off the limestone walls. "The manuscripts you seek have been protected by an unbroken chain of guardians since the time of Constantine himself." Daniel's heart hammered as they approached a heavy wooden door bound with iron. The recent attempt on his life at the Mount of Olives had left him hypervigilant, but Marcus had proven his authenticity through knowledge only the true guardians possessed. The monk produced an ornate key, its design matching symbols Daniel had seen in his research on early Christian iconography. The chamber beyond took his breath away. Ancient scrolls lined wooden shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their parchment surfaces bearing the patina of ages. But it was the central table that drew his attention. Upon it lay 3 manuscripts, their Aramaic text clearly visible even in the dim light. "The lost writings of Thomas," Marcus said solemnly. "The actual records, not the Gnostic copies found at Nag Hammadi. These contain Jesus' own words about the nature of his mission, recorded by one who knew him intimately." Daniel approached the table with trembling hands. The parchment was remarkably well preserved, the ink still legible after nearly 2,000 years. As he began to translate the opening lines, his academic excitement warred with a growing sense of unease. "This speaks of Jesus as a teacher of wisdom," he murmured, "not as divine. It describes his followers as students of a new philosophy rather than witnesses to miraculous resurrection." "Continue reading," Marcus urged quietly. The next passages made Daniel's breath catch. Here was Jesus speaking of death as a natural transition, of his teachings as a way to understand the divine spark within every human soul. There was no mention of substitutionary atonement, no claim to exclusive divinity, no promise of miraculous resurrection from the dead. "If these are authentic," Daniel whispered, "they would fundamentally challenge everything." The voice came from behind them. Daniel spun to see Cardinal Toretti emerging from the shadows, flanked by 2 men in dark suits, which is precisely why they must never see daylight. Brother Marcus stepped protectively between Daniel and the cardinal. "You have no authority here, Toretti. This is neutral ground, protected by agreements older than your office." Toretti's smile was cold. "Brother, you misunderstand the situation. Dr. Cross has been conducting unauthorized research, stealing artifacts, endangering lives. He's wanted by multiple authorities. That's a lie, Daniel said. But even as the words left his mouth, he realized how precarious his position had become. His academic credentials meant nothing here, deep beneath Jerusalem with only an aging monk as witness. The manuscripts will be returned to proper church custody, Toretti continued. Dr. Cross will face appropriate consequences for his reckless pursuit of heretical materials. One of the cardinal's men moved toward the table, but Marcus raised his hand. Touch those writings and you violate sanctuary that has stood for 16 centuries. There will be consequences you cannot imagine. For a moment, the chamber fell silent except for the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Daniel's mind raced, calculating distances to the door, wondering if there were other passages leading from this chamber. The truth doesn't belong to any institution, he said finally. These manuscripts are part of human heritage, not church property to be hidden away. Toretti's expression hardened. Some truths are too dangerous for ordinary minds to comprehend. The church has guided humanity for 2 millennia. Would you destroy that foundation for the sake of academic curiosity? I would preserve it by ensuring it rests on honesty rather than suppression. The cardinal nodded to his men, who stepped forward despite Marcus's warning. But as they reached for the manuscripts, the monk did something unexpected. He produced a small device and pressed a button. Immediately, alarms began sounding throughout the complex above. Emergency lighting flickered on, and the distant sound of running feet echoed down the passages. The manuscripts are electronically tagged, Marcus explained calmly. Moving them without proper authorization triggers security protocols involving multiple religious authorities and the Israeli Antiquities Authority. You'll find this chamber surrounded within minutes. Toretti's face flushed with anger. You've merely delayed the inevitable, brother. There are forces at work here beyond your understanding. Then perhaps, Daniel said, quickly photographing pages with his phone before anyone could stop him, it's time those forces stepped into the light. The sound of voices grew closer, and Toretti gestured sharply to his men. They retreated toward what must have been another passage, but not before the cardinal fixed Daniel with a stare that promised retribution. This isn't finished, Doctor. Some doors should never be opened. The ancient stones of the Herodium fortress pressed cold against David's back as he crouched behind a crumbling wall, clutching the leather satchel containing the manuscripts. Dawn was still hours away, but the searchlight sweeping across the archaeological site told him Cardinal Toretti's men had found them. How many? Sarah whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the desert air. David peered around the edge of the wall. 6 figures moved systematically through the ruins, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the weathered limestone blocks that had stood here since the time of Herod the Great. 6 that I can see. Maybe more. Father Miguel's weathered hands trembled as he gripped his walking stick. The elderly priest had insisted on accompanying them to this final site, claiming the manuscripts had mentioned something hidden beneath Herod's tomb. Now David wondered if bringing him had been a fatal mistake. There, Miguel pointed to a narrow passage between 2 collapsed chambers. The entrance to the lower chambers should be through there. If the text is accurate, what we seek lies beneath the mountain itself. A burst of automatic gunfire shattered the pre-dawn silence, bullets sparking off the stones inches from Sarah's head. They were no longer being hunted, they were being executed. David grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward Miguel's passage, the priest moving with surprising agility for his age. The narrow corridor descended steeply into the heart of the artificial mountain Herod had constructed around his tomb. Emergency lights mounted by the archaeological team provided weak illumination, casting eerie shadows on walls that hadn't seen sunlight for 2 millennia. They're following us down, Sarah said, glancing back at the bobbing flashlight beams behind them. The passage opened into a vast chamber carved from the living rock. David had read about this place, but had never seen it, Herod's actual burial chamber discovered only years before by archaeologists. But Miguel led them past the reconstructed sarcophagus toward what appeared to be a solid wall. Here, the priest said, running his fingers along seemingly random scratches in the stone. The manuscript spoke of the 7 stars of David, arranged as they appeared on the night of the great king's birth. David studied the markings with new eyes. What he'd dismissed as random damage suddenly revealed itself as a pattern, 7 small holes arranged in a constellation. You think this is what Thomas hid? Not Thomas, Miguel said, pressing his fingers into the holes in a specific sequence. Someone much earlier, someone who knew the truth about what really happened in Jerusalem. A grinding sound echoed through the chamber as a section of the wall swung inward, revealing another passage. Shouts echoed from the corridor behind them. Their pursuers were closing fast. They plunged into the hidden tunnel, Miguel surprisingly taking the lead. The passage sloped downward at a sharp angle, roughly hewn from the bedrock. David's flashlight beam revealed ancient chisel marks on the walls, but also something else, symbols that matched those in the manuscripts. This wasn't built by Herod's workers, Sarah said, studying the markings. These symbols are older, much older. The tunnel ended abruptly at a small chamber barely large enough for the 3 of them to stand. But it was what the chamber contained that made David's breath catch. The walls were covered in text, not carved, but painted in what looked like the same ink used in the manuscripts they'd been carrying. Aramaic, David breathed, moving closer to examine the writing. But the script is archaic, even for the 1st century. Miguel was examining something in the corner, a small stone box, its lid carved with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the flashlight beam. 40 years I've searched for this, he said softly. 40 years since I first learned the truth about what the church has hidden. Miguel, Sarah said urgently, who are you really? The priest looked up, and for the first time David saw something other than kindness in his eyes. I am what Thomas of Didymos was, a keeper of the true record. The church branded him a heretic, claimed his gospel was false. But Thomas wasn't writing fiction, Dr. Rosen. He was preserving eyewitness accounts. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them. Their time was running out. The box, Miguel said, lifting it with reverent hands. This contains what Thomas died protecting. Not manuscripts, but something far more dangerous to those who built their power on carefully constructed lies. David heard the safety click off an automatic weapon somewhere in the darkness behind them. Cardinal Toretti's voice echoed through the tunnel, cultured and calm. Dr. Rosen, you've led us quite a chase, but this ends now. Some knowledge was never meant to see daylight. Miguel smiled and opened the stone box. Inside, nestled in ancient silk, lay a small piece of wood and a single scroll sealed with wax. The truth, Cardinal, he called back. The one thing your predecessors feared most. The sound of running feet grew louder. David realized they were trapped, but somehow, looking at what Miguel held in his weathered hands, he no longer cared about escape. Some discoveries were worth dying for. The ancient stones beneath Daniel's feet seemed to pulse with significance as he followed the narrow path through the Judean hills. Each step brought him closer to the coordinates hidden within the Damascus manuscript, coordinates that had led him away from the tourist trails and into the heart of the wilderness where Jesus had once walked. Sarah moved beside him, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. They had managed to slip away from Jerusalem before dawn, but both knew their enemies wouldn't be far behind. The weight of the recovered manuscripts in Daniel's backpack felt heavier than their physical mass. They carried the burden of truth that powerful forces would kill to suppress. The monastery should be just ahead, Sarah whispered, consulting the GPS coordinates one final time. According to the Damascus text, Brother Marcus established it in 67 CE, shortly after the destruction of the Jerusalem community. The path curved around a massive boulder, and suddenly they found themselves facing what appeared to be nothing more than a weathered cliff face. Daniel's heart sank. Had they misinterpreted the coordinates? Were they too late? Sarah approached the rock wall, running her hands along its surface. "Wait," she breathed. "Look at these markings." Carved into the stone, barely visible after 2 millennia of erosion, were symbols that matched those they had seen in the Damascus manuscript. Sarah pressed against a particular sequence, and to their amazement, a section of the wall shifted inward with a grinding of ancient mechanisms. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying with it the scent of age and secrets. Daniel activated his flashlight, its beam revealing a corridor that disappeared into darkness. They exchanged a glance before stepping across the threshold into history. The passage led deeper into the hillside, its walls lined with niches that once held oil lamps. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, a reminder that they were likely the first people to walk this path in centuries. Daniel's pulse quickened as they reached a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Beyond the door lay a chamber that took their breath away. The walls were covered with frescoes depicting scenes from early Christian life, but these were unlike any Daniel had ever seen. Here, Jesus appeared not as the divine savior of traditional iconography, but as a revolutionary teacher surrounded by both men and women disciples. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing in the sacred space. "Look at the inscriptions." Along the base of the walls, ancient Greek and Aramaic text told a story that challenged every foundation of Christian doctrine. Daniel read aloud, his voice trembling. "The teacher said unto us, I am not the Son of God, but a son of man who would show you the way to God within yourselves." They moved deeper into the chamber, where stone shelves held pottery jars, similar to those found at Qumran. With reverent care, Daniel opened the first vessel. Inside, wrapped in preserved linen, were scrolls that would redefine Christianity forever. The first document bore the unmistakable hand of Mary Magdalene, not as a reformed prostitute, but as Jesus' closest disciple and philosophical equal. Her words described Jesus' true mission, not to establish a religion, but to free humanity from the need for religious intermediaries. The resurrection, Sarah read from another scroll, was not of the flesh, but of the spirit of the teacher's message within his followers. A sound from the corridor froze them both. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Cardinal Toretti's voice carried through the ancient stones, "They're here. Seal all exits." Daniel's mind raced. They had perhaps minutes before discovery. He began photographing the documents with desperate speed, while Sarah gathered the most crucial scrolls. These truths had hidden in darkness for 2,000 years. He wouldn't let them disappear again. "There's another passage," Sarah hissed, pointing to a narrow opening behind the altar. They could hear voices growing closer, commands being barked in Italian and English. As they squeezed through the hidden exit, Daniel caught a final glimpse of the chamber's greatest treasure, a letter bearing the seal of Pontius Pilate, documenting his conversations with a revolutionary teacher who spoke not of kingdoms in heaven, but of justice on earth. The passage led to a cave opening high on the cliff face, overlooking the valley below. Behind them, shouts of discovery echoed from the monastery. Toretti and his men had found the chamber, but Daniel and Sarah had escaped with proof that would shake the foundations of faith itself. Looking back at the ancient stones that had guarded their secrets for millennia, Daniel realized the real journey was just beginning. They possessed the truth, but truth without the power to share it was merely burden. The question now was whether they would live long enough to reveal what they had found. The ancient stones of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre felt cold beneath Daniel's palms as he pressed against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The echo of footsteps grew louder in the narrow corridor behind them, accompanied by urgent whispers in what sounded like Italian. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers trembling but steady. "This way," Father Castellanos whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant chanting from the evening service. The elderly priest led them through a maintenance passage Daniel hadn't known existed, past pipes and electrical conduits that hummed with the building's hidden life. The manuscripts felt heavy in Daniel's satchel, their weight seeming to increase with each step. 3 days had passed since their discovery in the cave beneath Golgotha, 3 days of running, hiding, and watching shadows. The implications of what they'd found continued to reverberate through his mind like aftershocks from an earthquake. How much further? Sarah breathed. Almost there, Castellanos replied, pausing at what appeared to be a solid wall. His weathered fingers found a concealed latch, and a section of stone swung inward on silent hinges. Welcome to the real heart of this place. They emerged into a circular chamber that predated the church above by centuries. Roman stones formed the foundation, but beneath those, Daniel could see even older masonry. Aramaic inscriptions covered portions of the walls, and in the center sat a simple stone table bearing the marks of countless ages. "My God," Daniel whispered, his archaeological instincts overriding his fear for a moment. "This is 1st century, maybe earlier." Indeed. Castellanos lit several oil lamps, their flames dancing across the ancient surfaces. There are places in Jerusalem that remember Dr. Rourke, places that have kept their secrets for 2,000 years. Sarah moved to examine the inscriptions, her knowledge of ancient languages immediately engaging. These aren't just decorative, they're instructions, warnings, both. Came a new voice from the shadows. Daniel spun, his hand instinctively reaching for the satchel, but the figure who emerged wasn't one of their pursuers. The man was perhaps 60, with intelligent dark eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent in careful work. He wore simple clothes, but there was something in his bearing that commanded respect. "Dr. Rourke, Miss Chen," Castellanos said formally. "I'd like you to meet Brother Marcus. He represents certain interests that have been watching your progress with great concern." "Watching us?" Daniel's suspicion flared. "Are you with the Vatican? The Foundation?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I represent those who have been guardians of truth far longer than either organization has existed. We are what remains of a brotherhood that has protected certain knowledge since the time of Constantine." "Protected it or suppressed it?" Sarah challenged. "Both, when necessary." Marcus approached the stone table, his movements reverent. "The manuscripts you've discovered, Dr. Rourke, they are not the first of their kind, nor I suspect will they be the last, but they may be the most dangerous." Daniel clutched the satchel tighter. "Dangerous to whom?" "To everyone, to the faith of billions, to the power structures that have grown around that faith, to the very fabric of Western civilization." Marcus's eyes held no malice, only a deep sadness. "Truth is not always liberating, Doctor. Sometimes it is simply destructive. That's not our choice to make," Daniel said firmly. "These documents belong to history, to humanity." "Do they?" Marcus gestured to the walls around them. "This chamber has housed similar revelations for 17 centuries. Documents that spoke of a very human Jesus. Letters that suggested the resurrection was metaphor rather than miracle. Testimonies that painted the apostles as men with agendas rather than perfect vessels of divine will." Sarah's face had gone pale. "You've been hiding evidence for centuries." "We've been preventing wars, Miss Chen. Preventing the collapse of institutions that, whatever their flaws, provide meaning and structure to billions of lives. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices." The sound of approaching voices echoed from the passage they'd used to enter. Castellanos moved quickly to the hidden door, his face grave. "They've found us." "Cardinal Toretti's men," Marcus confirmed. "They represent the more aggressive approach to protecting church doctrine. They would see the manuscripts destroyed and their discoverers silenced permanently." Daniel felt the walls closing in, the weight of history and conspiracy pressing down on him. "What do you want from us?" "A choice," Marcus replied simply. "Come with us. Let us take the manuscripts to safety, add them to the collection that already exists in places like this one. Your discoveries will be preserved but contained, available to a select few scholars who understand the delicate balance between truth and stability. And if we refuse..." Marcus glanced toward the passage where the voices grew steadily louder. "Then you face whatever awaits beyond that door. And Dr. Rourke, I assure you, Toretti's people are far less interested in preservation than we are." The footsteps were close now, accompanied by the metallic whisper of weapons being readied. The ancient stone steps of the Via Dolorosa seemed to pulse beneath David's feet as he clutched the final manuscript fragment to his chest. Blood seeped through his shirt from the shoulder wound, but adrenaline kept him moving through the narrow Jerusalem alleyways. Behind him, the echo of pursuit grew closer. Boots on cobblestone, urgent shouts in multiple languages. Cardinal Toretti's men had found him at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, just as he deciphered the last crucial passage, the text that changed everything. Not just the translation of Jesus' teachings, but documentation of his survival, his escape from the cross, his years of continued ministry in communities scattered across the ancient world. The implications crashed through David's mind like thunder. Christianity as the world knew it was built on a magnificent misunderstanding. Professor Kellerman, the voice belonged to Agent Sarah Chen, the Vatican investigator who'd been tracking him for weeks. She appeared from a shadowed doorway, gun drawn but lowered. "We need to talk." David pressed himself against the limestone wall, gasping. "If you're here to stop me from revealing the truth, I'm here to help you survive long enough to make that choice yourself." She glanced nervously down the alley. "Toretti's convinced the Cardinal's Council that you're a threat to the faith itself. They've authorized extreme measures." The sound of approaching vehicles echoed off the ancient walls. David looked at the woman who'd become both hunter and, apparently, protector. "Why should I trust you?" "Because 3 hours ago I read the preliminary translations you sent to Professor Martinez in Madrid." Her eyes held a mixture of awe and terror. "Because I understand what you found, and I know what it means." She paused, holstering her weapon. "And because my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor who taught me that some truths are more important than the institutions that fear them." David felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. The manuscript fragment in his hands contained direct quotes from Thomas, Jesus' twin brother, accounts of private conversations, plans for establishing communities of followers who would preserve the real teachings. Not divine sacrifice, but radical compassion. Not resurrection, but transformation. Not salvation through death, but liberation through love, lived fearlessly. "They'll kill us both," he whispered. "Probably." Sarah's smile was grim. "But my grandfather also taught me that dying for truth is different than dying for lies." The roar of motorcycle engines filled the narrow street. David saw black-clad figures rounding the corner, automatic weapons visible. This wasn't ecclesiastical politics anymore. This was war. "This way." Sarah grabbed his uninjured arm, pulling him toward a barely visible gap between buildings. They squeezed through into a passage so narrow their shoulders scraped the walls. Behind them, angry voices shouted orders in Italian and Arabic. The passage opened into a small courtyard where an elderly Palestinian woman sat shelling peas. She looked up at the bloodied American professor and the armed Chinese agent with complete calm, as if such scenes were merely Tuesday afternoon entertainment. "Ahlan wa sahlan," she said softly, gesturing toward a wooden door. "Welcome." Sarah and David exchanged glances. Trust had become their only currency. They followed the woman into a house that felt older than memory itself. Faded photographs covered the walls. Families, children, decades of life lived in the shadow of conflict. "My great-grandfather was a stonecutter who worked on the excavations beneath the Dome of the Rock in 1897, the woman said in careful English. "He found manuscripts then, hid them, waited 90 years for someone to come who would understand their importance." She studied David's face intently. "You have his eyes, the eyes of one who sees what others fear to see." She disappeared into a back room, returning with a metal box covered in decades of dust. Inside, David found not just more manuscript fragments, but photographs, dozens of them, documenting archaeological finds that had been systematically suppressed for over a century. "The church has known," David breathed. "They've known all along." The sounds of search teams grew closer, dogs barking, orders being barked in return. "Professor," Sarah said urgently, "we need to make a decision. Run, and maybe live to fight another day. Or..." or stand here and make our choice meaningful? David looked at the manuscripts spread before him, then at the faces of the two women who'd risked everything to bring him to this moment. Outside, he could hear vehicles surrounding the building. He thought of Jesus walking these same streets 2,000 years ago, carrying truths that threatened the established order of his time. Some battles, David realized, weren't meant to be won through escape or clever strategy. Some battles were won by refusing to run, by insisting that truth mattered more than safety. "Get me to a computer," he said quietly. "If we're doing this, the whole world needs to see what we've found." Sarah nodded, checking her weapon. The old woman smiled, revealing gap-toothed courage that had survived decades of occupation and conflict. Outside, the first boots hit the courtyard stones. The helicopter's rotors cut through the pre-dawn silence as Dr. Marcus Chen stood at the edge of the ancient amphitheater, clutching the leather satchel that had cost so many lives. The manuscripts inside seemed to pulse with their own weight, not just parchment and ink, but the accumulated faith and doubt of 2,000 years. "You cannot run forever, Dr. Chen." Cardinal Toretti's voice carried across the stone seats, amplified by the acoustic perfection the Romans had engineered. The elderly man descended slowly, flanked by armed figures in tactical gear. "The Church has endured for 2 millennia. It will endure this." Marcus turned to face them, his hand instinctively tightening on the satchel's strap. Behind him, the Mediterranean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, painted silver by the rising moon. Endure, yes, but should it endure on lies? Sarah emerged from behind a collapsed column, her press badge catching the helicopter's searchlight. Her camera hung ready at her side, though Marcus wondered if either of them would live to see her story published. "The world deserves to know," she called out. These manuscripts prove that the Council of Nicaea wasn't just about doctrine, it was about power, about choosing which version of Christ's message would survive. Toretti's laugh was bitter. "And what would you have us do? Destroy the faith of billions? Tell them that their Savior was perhaps more human than divine? That the resurrection they've built their eternal hope upon might have been metaphorical? Maybe faith shouldn't require ignorance," Marcus said, stepping forward. The ancient stones beneath his feet had witnessed gladiators and martyrs, spectacles of life and death. How fitting that this moment should unfold here, where truth and performance had always been separated by the thinnest of margins. The manuscripts had taken him from Oxford's quiet libraries to the caves of Qumran, from Vatican archives to this windswept amphitheater on the Turkish coast. Each revelation had peeled away another layer of certainty, until only questions remained. The Johannine community's hidden gospel, the suppressed accounts of Christ's teachings about the kingdom within, the deliberate omission of texts that portrayed Jesus not as a supernatural being, but as a revolutionary teacher whose message threatened both Roman authority and religious orthodoxy. "You speak of destroying faith," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "But what about the faith of those early Christians who believed differently, whose voices were silenced by councils and emperors? Don't their beliefs matter?" The helicopter circled lower, its downdraft scattering dust and debris. Marcus could see more figures rappelling down, surrounding the amphitheater. Whatever happened next would happen quickly. Sarah moved to his side, her presence a small comfort in the vastness of what they faced. "Marcus, the upload is ready. One signal from me, and these manuscripts go live on every major news network simultaneously. They can't silence all of us." Toretti raised his hand, and the tactical team froze. "Dr. Chen, you are a man of learning. Surely you understand that truth is not always truth. Context matters, interpretation matters. These manuscripts you found, they represent one community's beliefs, not universal revelation." "Exactly," Marcus said. "One community among many. That's the point. Early Christianity was diverse, vibrant, full of different understandings of who Jesus was and what he meant. The Church chose uniformity over diversity, control over mystery. These manuscripts show that." The cardinal's face was grave in the helicopter's harsh light, and in doing so, It created something lasting, something that could survive persecutions and dark ages, that could inspire cathedrals and hospitals, art and mercy. Would your precious diversity have accomplished that? It was a fair question, one that had haunted Marcus throughout this journey. How many times had organized religion inspired both transcendence and tyranny? How many lives had been saved by faith and how many destroyed by it? I don't know, Marcus admitted, but people deserve the chance to choose for themselves. With all the information, with all the questions intact. Sarah's finger hovered over her phone. The manuscripts could be transmitted in seconds, scattered across the digital world where even the Vatican couldn't retrieve them. But Marcus found himself hesitating. Once released, there would be no taking back the chaos that might follow. Churches might split, believers might lose their anchor, the comfortable certainties that helped millions through dark nights might crumble. But in that hesitation, Marcus heard an echo of every authority figure who had ever justified suppressing truth for the greater good. The Council of Nicaea, the Inquisition, every moment when someone had decided that people couldn't handle reality. He looked at Toretti, seeing not an enemy but a fellow seeker struggling with impossible choices. Your Eminence, maybe faith that can't survive questions isn't worth preserving. Sarah pressed send. The truth was free now, racing through fiber optic cables toward a world that might not be ready for it. But as Marcus watched the Cardinal's shoulders slump in defeat, he felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but a deep, abiding hope that humanity might finally be ready to embrace both faith and doubt, walking forward into an uncertain but honest dawn.